and welcome to Perspectives. This is the first of a series of flagship discussion programs bringing together Asia's top minds to discuss political, security and economic issues facing the region. My guests tonight, Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador-at-Large at Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Professor Wong Kang-Woo, Chairman of the East Asian Institute, and Associate Professor Robert Beckman, the Director for the Centre of International Law at the National University of Singapore. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Now, Professor Koh, can I just start off with you and to discuss the first big question that we have today facing Asia, that we have the US and China as arguably two most important powers in the world. Are we seeing the emergence of a new Cold War between these two powers, and how would this affect Asia?
If rational minds prevail, there will not be a new Cold War between the United States and China. And the reason I say this is that the relationship between them has become a symbiotic one. China needs peace with the United States in order to continue to concentrate on its development. China also needs access to the US market. The United States has become the world's largest debtor nation, and the biggest creditor is China. So for them to embark upon a collision course makes no sense. But rationality does not always prevail.
So are you optimistic, gentlemen, that rationality will prevail, or is the rhetoric coming out from the US right now because of the presidential elections coming up? Is it just rhetoric, or is it going to be a rough ride going ahead? Professor Beckman?
I would say there's going to be rhetoric perhaps on both sides. There always is in the U.S. during election year. But again, rational minds, I expect, will prevail. There is a common economic interest. There's a common interest in maintaining freedoms of the seas, especially for trade. But there is a rivalry because the U.S. sees China's defense growth as a threat to its dominance in the seas in the East Asian region. So there is going to be some tension because of that.
But it will be a long time before China can actually challenge the US militarily in any way. Professor Wang, you had an interesting point of view about the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland and how this has changed the US military thinking, or your thinking about its defense position in Asia. Could you share that with us, please?
Well, so much of it really depends on how you see the world as a kind of static world in which everything that is fixed today, the status quo, should always remain, or you see there's a dynamics going on all the time. And the fact that China is rising and gaining influence, economic and political influence generally, is a change. So whether you can say everything stays the same no matter what happens in China is the kind of question that even the Chinese wonder about. So the relationship with Taiwan was fixed at a particular point of time. It was really fixed with the Korean War, with the Chiang Kai-shek going over there, having been defeated. And out of that particular situation, the treaty was signed, and it was again endorsed by the Cold War. There's the kind of front line between two forces of capitalism and communism. So all that belonged to a particular period. Now, if we say that the Cold War is over, and if we say that it's no longer an ideological struggle of great proportions as it used to be, then are those treaties fixed forever or not? And the status quo is changing. Relativities are changing all the time. So I think that's the question of attitude towards how the world ought to be. Ought to be continually adjusting to one another as things change, or it's fixed forever and nobody's allowed to change anything. And if anybody tries, then it becomes a source of great friction. And that's, I think, a very fundamental difference in outlook there.
I think the power equation between the United States and China is gradually changing. China is growing more powerful. We hope the United States will rebound from this current crisis and remain strong. The jury's out on that. But certain things are fixed. No? One, that Taiwan should not unilaterally seek independence. And if Taiwan does that, then there will be repercussions. Secondly, that the mainland should not force the pace on reunification. Let the process of reunification takes its own time. I think if we respect the three no's, I guess, no independence, no use of force, then I think cross-state relations will remain stable and equitable. Would you agree with that?
I think that's entirely logical and rational, as it were. But again, as I said, the status quo has to be defined in people's minds. What is the proper status quo? If, for example, the Chinese say the proper relationship, one day Taiwan should be part of China, because it's always been part of China. That is, if that's their starting point, then that's a very different definition of a status quo, which says the present situation of separation of Taiwan and China should remain forever. If you start with opposite positions like that, you're likely to have misunderstanding.
Another element of this is that during the Cold War, you had the non-aligned movement, and you had different factions within the world community that sided with one or the other. I think its situation has changed.
Yes.
There is no constituency that is the American constituency, nor is there one on the Chinese side. People would like to see better relations between China and the United States. Other countries would like to see, because it's good for the world. The economies of all these countries would improve. So,
but there are, sorry Gopi to interrupt you, but there are friends of mine within the United States who are still fighting the Cold War, who are unreconstructed Cold Warriors.
Personal
I mean, they are still fighting the communists, you know?
Yeah.
So for them,
knowledge level must be distinguished between the thinkers and...
But they're influential. They are not without influence. There are influential Americans in the political process who would urge the Taiwanese to seek independence. And they would object. They would object to any proposal from the mainland that at the end of the day, Taiwan must return to the People's Republic of China. So I think you cannot say that the matter is no longer ideological, the issue is resolved. It's not.
It's not resolved, but it will not be a following.
And you know, we are sort of reasonably safe for the next 4 years with Ma Ying-jeou as president, but who knows? In the next presidential election, the DPP may come back to power, and the next leader of Taiwan may have a different view from President Ma Ying-jeou. And there could be tension again.
Yes, but in the present context, I think rationality will prevail, because the world does not want to see a rivalry that used to exist between US and USSR to continue. That sort of atmosphere to continue.
I have an optimistic view about this. Also, I share Ambassador Gopi and others about this one, that people are trying to prevent anything from going wrong. I think the bulk of all the countries involved, all public opinion is trying to avoid conflict. So I think that's on the side of optimism.
Yeah.
But do you think that smaller countries with whom the US, for instance, has a relationship like the Philippines, Japan, could actually spark a conflict with China that could then derail some of these very rational thinking, peace, peaceful rise of China. Yes,
I wouldn't describe Japan as a small country.
Japan is not a small
Japan
country.
is the world's third largest economy, 100 million people. It's not a small country.
Japan is critically important. It also relies on the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
Yeah, I think the U.S.
And the Philippines has the Mutual Defense Treaty.
That's right.
That's again going to be part of the balance that is worked out. How does China continue to adjust to the fact that the U.S. has strong defense relations with Japan, Philippines, and Korea?
I think one of the important questions for this century is the evolving relationship between China and Japan. It is a very long relationship, grounded in history, in culture, in all sorts of affinities, but it also carries a huge historical baggage. And although 60 years have passed since the end of the Pacific War, there has been no historic reconciliation yet between China and Japan. The other thing is that for a long time, Japan is the biggest tiger in the Asian forest. It is the tiger on the hill. And it feels uncomfortable being displaced by the Chinese tiger, you know. And because of the historical baggage that they both carry, this change in the relationship between China and Japan could prove to be troublesome. I don't know if Prof. Hung has an insight on this.
It is at the moment a very painful one for the Japanese. And I think the important thing is whether the Chinese want to take advantage of that pain, as it were, and make it even more painful, or whether they can understand the pain and come to some reasonable way of sorting out the pain so that it doesn't lead to direct conflict. I think how they behave to one another is quite important. And it seems to me that the leaders on both sides are trying very hard to avoid all the tensions that are actually among the people themselves.
Okay, sorry, carry on, yes, before we go for a break.
If I could say,
yes.
Interject here and put in a word for ASEAN. ASEAN has actually been very proactive in trying to organize relations between the great powers affecting the region. So in 1997, ASEAN convened the first meeting that included China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And you know, at that first meeting, the leaders of these three countries had never met. Yeah, and they just had breakfast, you know, prior to meeting us. The next year they had lunch, and then on the third year they actually had their own trilateral summit. Right. And I'm very happy that partly because of ASEAN's proactive diplomacy, China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea are now seriously discussing a trilateral free trade agreement among them. And this is very good. This is exactly the kind of thing we want.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Goh. We have to go for a short break. When we return, we'll pick up the point again about the relationship between Japan, Korea, and China, and the rest of Asia, and of course also about India. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, just before the break, we're talking about Japan and China and how Japan's views the rise of China. Let's turn our attention now to the next big power in Asia, and that's India. How concerned is India over the rise in of China?
I think India is quite concerned about the rise of China. I think basically because of the activities of China in the neighborhood. They seem to not understand that smaller powers, when they have a big gorilla next door, will tend to turn to other sources to support them. And that is what has happened. Both Pakistan and Bangladesh, even though they're very different governments, support China's involvement. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, they have also said this publicly, that they are very happy to see China. But this makes India very nervous. My view is that this is a sort of a pressure that China applies to India because of one factor, and that is Tibet. I think Chinese pressure on India will continue as long as the next Dalai Lama is not appointed. They're watching to see whether this Dalai Lama, the new one, will be appointed out of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of Arunachal Pradesh, which is controlled by India, claimed by China. If Taiwan is the source from where the new Dalai Lama comes, then I think China will be watching very closely what India is going to do. And I think China is sending signals to say, behave, because otherwise we have pressure points. Now, India being a large country is not likely to run to the US to say, this is our friend and umbrella and they will look after us. No, they are doing countermeasures. And that's when you have the activities in South China Sea, oil exploration, the tie-up with Vietnam and the sort of thing. But I see going forward, economically, China has become a major factor in India. Largest trading partner, 10% of the trade. Now an investment source, with investment increasing from about 25 million 5 years ago to $500 million. And it is also a source of funds.
So economically, that relationship is growing, right?
Extremely fast and extremely well.
Would I be right to say politically there is still a deficit of trust between India and China?
It's a deficit of trust and a deficit of information. They understand it.
Mutual understanding.
Both don't understand.
Okay.
You know, for instance, the press on both sides go to town on an overdrive.
Well, more on the Indian side than Chinese side.
Not quite, because the public, the blogs and so on in China are even more virulent than the Indian one.
I see.
India has one advantage, that if one says something is this, there'll be another guy to say exact opposite. Because controversy is part of the Indian psyche.
Yeah.
And therefore, there are a lot of defenders of China in India.
And also it's in the open press.
It's in the
rather
open
than
press.
Yes,
In China, it's a one-sided, and you know, this is what makes India very nervous.
To what extent, Kang Hu and Kopi, is the relationship still bedeviled by the 1962 border conflict?
Very much.
Particularly with the military, I think.
For the Indians. The Chinese, I think, have forgotten it. For them, it was just a skirmish. But for the Indians, it was a very humiliating experience. They felt that this was the way China got rid of another tiger from the mountain.
Right.
Because Nehru, you know, was the patron of Asia sort of thing. He wanted to introduce Chu and Lai, the Bandung Conference and sort of thing. So they said, that's not your place, we'll tell you what your place is. So they feel that humiliation. And that goes down very deep. So the trust is gone because of that.
I see.
So do you think there's a possibility that another border skirmish or a war could happen between these two countries?
I doubt very much, because I think both have matured. There is some noise from the PLA, some noise from the Indian side, but I think the decision makers, the security advisors in the Indian government, very good relations with the Chinese side, and they keep things balanced.
Is there... Yes,
They
Professor
both
Bradley.
have common interests in terms of maritime policy. They're both becoming major trading nations who are importing minerals and dependent on trade. And their maritime interests are extending beyond their coastlines to ensuring sea lines of communication are open, etc. But on the other hand, the Chinese are worried about India coming into the South China Sea, and the Indians are worried about China coming into the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
But and the U.S. is trying to balance the rise of both. But I think all three countries, together with Japan, have in the long run a common interest in many of the maritime issues.
I share Bob's view that as China and India evolve and become global players, their interests are not just in defending their coastline, but in defending the global commons and international rights of navigation and overflight.
I think the maritime part is particularly significant because I think in the past and many other times too, overland problems are usually quite easily settled on a bilateral basis. But once you go to the open sea, the sea actually draws numerous countries into any kind of discussion would involve more than one, in fact more than 10 countries maybe, once you get into maritime problems. So that way the Chinese have had to learn how to deal with multilateral problems all at the same time, which of course previously they've never really had to. Overland problems are really, and we're much simpler.
But I think Bob's happy point is that as far as the seas are concerned, the United States, Japan, China, and India have convergent interests. They are not in contradiction with one another.
Both, I would say.
Huh?
There is some contradiction as well.
Well, they're basically convergent interests because both the Chinese Navy and the Indian Navy wants to sail the seas of the world.
Yes.
You know, they want freedom of navigation. They want safe passage through the straits and archipelago. To that extent, the Chinese Navy, the Indian Navy, the American Navy, and the Japanese Navy have convergent interests.
But let's talk about the South China Sea then, where there are competing claims between all these, well, different small countries, and with China, with Taiwan as well. Is there a likelihood that one of these small countries, whether or not it's Vietnam or Philippines, could actually drag the U.S. into a conflict with China or India even in the South China Sea?
That's what we worry about.
Yes.
There is a mutual defense treaty between U.S. and Philippines,
yep.
but I think you'll notice that in the last 2 weeks the U.S. has been noticeably silent on the Scarborough Reef, and I think there's a good reason for that. And it's not in the U.S. interest or Chinese interest to allow this to become a big power conflict in any way, and I expect they would be encouraging the Philippines to negotiate. And on the other hand, you see the Vietnamese inviting the National Oil Company of India and the Russian oil companies in to help them in exploration as a way in which China would be more hesitant to interfere with the explorations because they don't want to pick a fight with a bigger power.
This is part and parcel of this multilateral thing, which makes the Chinese uncomfortable.
Yes.
They have, in a way, always insisted on bilateral things because that's what they used to in their overland historical relationships. But this ocean thing cannot be confined, it seems to me anyway, to bilateral relationships. And that is, I think, where the Chinese are going through a period of relearning how to deal with something that is going to always be multilateral. And all the other countries have also to realize that there's a learning process going on and not to push too hard, because I think there is room for very great misunderstandings on this one.
How about Japan? I mean, not in South China Sea, but talking about Japan's trying to regain influence in ASEAN. I mean, Japan used to be said as the best friend of ASEAN and Asia.
Was ASEAN best friend.
Yes. And with China's rise now, and now that Chinese economy is larger than Japanese economy, has Japan still got a role to play in the region?
I think so. And I will draw your attention to some recent developments which I think significant. The 4th Mekong-Japan Summit was just held last weekend in Tokyo. The leaders of the Mekong countries attended the summit, and the Japanese have now elevated the importance of helping the Mekong countries. And they pledge, I think, a very significant amount, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and especially Myanmar. The other thing is that Japan is trying to get back into the game by helping ASEAN to implement our so-called connectivity master plan. So I think that the Mekong and the connectivity master plan are two paradigms in which Japan can again make itself relevant and useful to ASEAN.
Japan has also become a major player in India of recent. They are involved in many infrastructure projects, at least steady stage.
The corridor, right? The
Bombay-Delhi corridor, and also some to the south. But the problem is Japan finds India a little bit of a cultural shock. So they have not been even as successful, I would say, as the Chinese in business. The Chinese, who are a recent player, take to India very easily. If a plane is delayed, they don't go berserk. Singaporeans and Japanese go berserk, because they're not sure how come it can be delayed. So Japanese find it difficult to cope with India, but they seem to show a lot of interest, and delegations after delegations. I have a Japanese partner in India, and Mitsubishi, and they are very interested to invest in.
I think at a strategic level, the leaders in Japan have decided that India is going to be a very important partner.
Yes.
But at a lower level, as Gopi said, that the Japanese are befuddled by the chaos of India.
All right. Thank you very much. We have to go for a next short break. When we return, we'll talk about Myanmar, Indochina, and the smaller nations in Southeast Asia, how they impact the relationship of the larger players in the region. Stay with us. Welcome back to Perspective. Now, let's talk about smaller nations, or the example of Myanmar. Earlier we spoke about Japan, now getting to Myanmar. This is an interesting, well, I think it's a very interesting story. I'm not sure what the story really is, because Myanmar has started to open up. The US and the Europeans are talking about lifting sanctions. China was rebuffed by Myanmar over this $3.6 billion US dam project. How does Myanmar manage its relations with larger powers in the wider scheme of things, and at the same time, what does ASEAN have to do with the entire situation?
Myanmar is embedded in ASEAN, and I would make a self-serving statement that unlike the West, the ASEAN countries have always engaged Myanmar, even in the worst of times, believing that the way to encourage them to reform, to open up, is not to isolate them or to reprimand them, but to encourage them. And I think that the ASEAN policy has been vindicated, So it's very naughty of the West to think that it's because of their sanction policy that our friends in Myanmar are opening up and embracing democracy. This is a very self-serving narrative of the West. It is not because of them. It is because of the internal compulsions. And I would also say that sanction policy has been a failure, because you can't impose a sanction policy on a country if there are three contiguous neighbors, China, India, and Thailand, do not join in that sanction policy. So
I think that's a very important point. And when you mentioned about how the Myanmar leadership coped with the fact that they were isolated by the West and so on, is that they have these neighbors and they are very skillful in maintaining good relations with each of them, each in different ways. And I think there must a lot of high marks must go to the kind of skill in which they played China and India, for example.
Exactly. What do you think about that relationship between India and Myanmar?
India did a 180-degree turn. India originally was very much against the junta and sort of thing. Then they realized that they were losing out on a very important source of raw material, an important neighbor, a connecting country with the rest of Southeast Asia. They changed it very quickly and very skillfully at very high level. And the Burmese responded, the Myanmaris responded very well. And now both, at least the Indians are, on the top of the world as far as Myanmar is concerned, because one of the few areas where they can show a success, because the immediate neighborhood is not so great. Yeah. And now they were talking about connectivity between India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and on to China, on to Thailand, and sort of that. So it is a good situation.
Professor Bergman, do you share the view that the West, really had no influence in what actually happened?
I didn't say no influence. I just say that it was not the sanctions policy that has produced these changes.
I agree with Tommy. I also would like to point out that the U.S. and Europe now are not in a position to. They don't have any alumni. They don't that have studied in the United States or Europe. They don't have the connections that they would have if they had not had sanctions. There would be many graduates that had studied in U.S. or Europe that they could now use to help influence developments, and they don't have any. They've been cut off for 25 years. They have to start from scratch. Whereas Japan and the ASEAN countries, India, have relations.
This is sort of below the radar, but the Japanese have been helping the talented people, young people in Myanmar. They've been studying all sorts of things in Japan, So there is a Japanese educated alumni in Myanmar. And as Myanmar opens up, this will be an asset to Myanmar and to Japan.
One has to add Singapore too. Singapore has done a great deal in sealing that relationship through education, I think. Lots of Myanmar
students, a lot of them here in Singapore.
And I think that now Myanmar is being courted by every country in the world because they see it as a future tiger, and it has the making of a future tiger economy.
So, of course, you have said earlier that it is a success of ASEAN as well. And do you think for ASEAN as well to be in the driver's seat in Asia, to be able to bring the larger parts of multilateral forum discussions, you mentioned that earlier, do you think this is a role that you can continue to play in the future?
Well, we are doing that by bringing the three countries in Northeast Asia together, Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea, and then bringing Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia together through ASEAN +3. And now we've got the larger family, the East Asia Summit, where we have not only brought India, Australia, New Zealand, but as from last year, the United States and Russia as well, So I think that ASEAN is playing an important soft power role of being the arbitrager, the convener, the mediator. And then I would say ASEAN is able to do this because of the nature of Southeast Asia. For centuries, Southeast Asia has been influenced by China and India, by the East and the West. And we are a very hybrid civilization, We are open, cosmopolitan, inclusive. So ASEAN can play this role.
I think one of the advantages, in fact, of having Myanmar so much in the limelight today is that it re-emphasizes that the most approximate neighbors to those big powers of India and China is Myanmar, and that it was not actively together working with everybody for the last few decades has been a weakness. And the return to Myanmar, to Southeast Asia and to the whole region, I think ties in the whole of Asia in a way that is the key point. I mean, of course, Southeast Asia, the whole of Southeast Asia has a maritime connection, but Myanmar is a land connection. And that's a bridge which goes back thousands of years. Trade and people have moved back and forth in that area.
Is it okay to quarrel with you?
Of course.
Can
Why
I
not?
can I take exception to a remark you made?
Which remark was
about
that?
Myanmar rebuffing China over
Yes,
the dam project. I
3.6
wouldn't use the
billion
word rebuff. I think President Tencent has made a brilliant new beginning. He needs to show to his own constituency that this is a new government. And that in the past, the previous government had not paid sufficient attention to environmental protection, that this would be different. And I think the dam project has been cancelled or is going to be reworked because not enough attention was paid to the protection of the environment in building the dam. So I wouldn't call it rebuff, but it's very important.
It was an embarrassment for China.
Sure, it's an embarrassment, China.
Yes,
But
because
I think the other side to it, the positive side to it, it shows that the Myanmar leaders have also have the capacity to compromise and to find a middle way. In other words, the picture of them being a rigid, unchanging and utterly unreasonable, that picture is just not true. They're perfectly capable of that. They've also learned that in this whole region, as the region is developing, everybody is also learning how to do that. Any rigid ideological or rigid material self-interest point of view are just not acceptable. I think that's a very good sign.
In fact, I would say that the Myanmarese government is absolutely brilliant in the way it's managed to maneuver and navigate its own space in that very difficult neighborhood. At the same time, get so much attention from the US and Europe and the EU. I'm not sure any of you...
If I could just take Professor Wang's point, I think this is very true. If you take one example, India is very concerned about the string of pearls. Chittagong in Sri Lanka, then Gwadar. But I just heard through the grapevine that Chittagong port, where the Chinese are thinking of building a deep water port, they have offered partnership to Indians and Americans. This is still informal, but it's being pursued. Now, if that is a model and it succeeds, it can solve a lot of problems and reduce the insecurity that India feels being surrounded by Chinese ports. Whether it will happen, we don't know. But at least the fact that they're considering it, I think is a plus point.
Do you see in your research with the different military powers in the region a concern at the rise of China's military and maritime capability perspective?
In the neighborhood, I guess there's always anxiety if there's a rising power that is becoming a superpower economically and militarily. I think the major anxiety relates, however, to the South China Sea, again, in terms of especially Vietnam and Philippines. And part of that is the Chinese unwillingness to completely clarify what their claim is. And that creates tremendous pressure from the Philippines and Vietnam. They believe they want to explore for gas and oil in certain areas which they don't think are in dispute, but China seems to have a different view, and these are the potential flashpoints.
All right, thank you. We'll have to go for another short break. When we come back, we'll pick up that point about the South China Sea and have a little bit more in-depth discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, at the last segment, we discussed about flashpoints and the potential flashpoint of the South China Sea. What do you think is the worst-case scenario in the South China Sea that could lead to a conflict?
Worst-case scenario is probably an exploration activity by one of the countries in what they believe is their economic zone, which is challenged by China. And cool heads don't prevail and shots are fired and then there's an incident which nobody wants. I think that's and that could escalate, and that's what we worry about. Whether it's over arrest of the fishing vessels or whether it's interference with a seismic survey vessel, it's this kind of incident.
Is it possible, Bob, for an arrangement whereby all these things are settled by Coast Guard officials, or other kinds of shipping and officials being sent around, rather than sending a naval vessel on any side? If people could avoid using naval vessels, but actually have local officials dealing with these
well, there was
cases.
just a report by the International Crisis
Yeah, I don't think that helps.
It's part of the problem.
In fact, one of the problems in China is that South China Sea policy not being made by any one central coordinating body. The International Crisis Group released a paper last week pointing out in China there are 12 ministerial level agencies involved in the game, and each of it is setting its own policy. So that's one of the problems. But can I be a contrarian and bring some calm to the discussion of the South China Sea and point out there are many areas of commonalities between China and the 4 claimant countries. One, all of them agree that the disputes should be settled peacefully. Second, they agree that the dispute should be settled in accordance with international law, and specifically the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Third, that they should pay heed to the 2002 Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea, and all of them have committed themselves to drafting a future binding code of conduct. So my appeal to these countries is not to provoke each other and not to escalate. And if they cannot resolve the dispute peacefully through negotiation, maybe they should consider going for joint development in disputed areas. And if that's not possible, maybe they should emulate the good examples of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, and take these disputes to arbitration or adjudication. I mean, that's my appeal to my Chinese friends and to my Malaysian, Vietnamese, Filipino, and Brunei friends.
Well, Professor Wang, do you think China would subject itself to international arbitration, though?
As far as I understand it, they would hesitate about that, partly because they don't believe that it would resolve the question to anybody's satisfaction. There are too many claimants involved. In fact, the Chinese believe that it would be simpler if things could be negotiated bilaterally. They actually believe that. And of course, as I understand it anyway, it's impossible to sort things out bilaterally, partly because the so-called markings on the South China Sea, and particularly in the Spratlys, none of them may seem to me make any kind of sense that would satisfy people, even if you start redrawing the maps. In fact, I can't see how you can do that. And of course, I think the Chinese have to start with, have to relook at that map again. I don't think they were right to have put that before the United Nations. They were something that they used themselves, that's all right, but once you put it down as a legal document, it creates untold problems for everybody.
It was Deng Xiaoping who proposed that if we cannot resolve the sovereignty disputes, why don't we put that aside and go for joint development? Would the Chinese government follow Deng Xiaoping's good advice?
I believe the Chinese are prepared to do joint development,
That's
but then
their official position.
That's the official position.
So
And Scarborough Shoal is
my question to Bob is, how do we translate this from a doctrine to practice? How do we apply joint development?
To me, the easy case could be Scarborough Shoal, because there's only 2 countries involved, China and Philippines, and it's fisheries, not oil. So they should be able to cooperate, have a cooperative arrangement to share the fisheries resources in that area, and each police their own vessels.
But the key to it is that neither side talks in terms of solving the dispute, but talks in terms of cooperation, because that's
Not in the press, but their official statements are in terms of the sovereignty. They can set aside the sovereignty and jointly share the fisheries resources. It's possible, and that could be that's the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, because there's only China and one other country.
So I think that I wouldn't preclude that. Joint development is possible between Philippines and China and Scarborough Shoal, and joint development may be possible between China and Vietnam in certain areas.
Near their
And one last point I would make is to appeal to all the claimant countries that as long as the disputes are on the table, they must not undertake drilling in the disputed areas.
They could spark.
Any drilling, no, it's contrary to international law, you know, and it's, in my view, unnecessarily provocative.
And what do you think is another potential flashpoint for Asia's concern?
I think what happens between what happens in Tibet and what the situation, the India-China relationship, I think is basically my views that it is dominated by the Tibetan issue, unsaid, unspoken, but still dominant. And the next appointment of the Dalai Lama, the successor to the present Dalai Lama, would have a major impact. And if it doesn't go China's way, or it is not something, because China cannot compromise on Tibet. It is a core issue. It is a troublesome issue. I don't think they've been very successful in handling the issue. China is not very good at handling crisis. They get a little either too rough or a little difficult. But it is an issue that they will solve in one way or the other, and it could lead to some armed conflict.
Could I enlarge this conversation and
Yes.
bring Prof. Wang in?
Yes, sir.
Who's our guru in China. The people not only in Tibet but also in Xinjiang seem to be alienated, you know. So my question to Prof. Wang is, if we respect that these are two areas of core interest to China and that they will remain part of China, what can China do to win the hearts and minds of the Uyghurs and the Tibetan people?
Because they are very good materialists, they have always worked on the assumption that by providing funding, investments, building the infrastructure in all these places, the people will come round to accept Chinese rule. And to that extent, they've misunderstood the spiritual needs of the people in both these territories. I think they miss many opportunities. And part of I think this is a rather simplistic view, is that if people are well off, they will come round. I think that needs to be revisited, it seems to me.
Yeah.
It does need to.
You see,
There's
China's
a problem with them.
policy, for instance, of bringing Han Chinese into Tibetan areas, flooding the area, or whether it's Xinjiang, I think it goes to the core of the people there. They say, you are discarding our culture, you are trying to this thing. I'm not trying to play advocate to the Indian solutions, but if you take Khalistan, the way the Indians tackled it was they had so many Sikhs on the Indian side who could go in and fight for them. The police guy, for instance, who finally brought peace was a Sikh. So instead of putting non-Sikhs in there and trying to dilute the Sikhs, they did the other way around, you know. And even today, Kashmir, there's a lot of call about sending people from the plains up into Kashmir and diluting it. Indian government wisely has kept away from that. Because as long as you don't do that, there is still a possibility of talking. And this is where I think probably a mistake is being made, because you try and dilute the local population.
Since we're talking about flashpoint, could I provoke Gopi and talk about Kashmir as a flashpoint?
Kashmir,
Is it big enough a flashpoint? For
I
the
don't
rest of
think
Asia,
so.
or-
The Indians show a lot of concern about China being involved on the Pakistani side of Kashmir, but it is more noise than anything
No,
else.
I don't mean the Chinese involvement. I mean Kashmir as an issue that will keep India and Pakistan apart and prevent South Asia from emulating what we, ASEAN, have achieved in Southeast Asia.
There are 2 points. I can't see South Asia be successfully emulating Southeast Asia for various factors.
Okay.
You know, but Kashmir, I think probably the flashpoint is delayed now. I mean, there is nothing looming at the moment. One, Pakistan and India are now much more cordial to each other. Pakistan just returned the favor on MFN for India, and they're talking about joint investments, the travels and so on, and restrictions. So I think it looks better, provided the army has accepted it. from Pakistan side. So I don't see that as a possible. The aggravation that the Indians were feeling was that the Chinese workers in Pakistani side of Kashmir, whom they thought were soldiers or they claim as soldiers, now that also has gone down. And I won't be surprised if there are Chinese workers on the Indian side as well, because there are a lot of power projects coming up, and the Chinese dominate the power industry in India.
Bottom line is you don't see a new war between India and
No,
Pakistan?
I don't.
Thank you very much. We've all run out of time. Ambassador Gopinath, Professor Beckman, Professor Koh, Professor Wang, thank you very much. We hope you found tonight's discussion insightful. Keep talking, writing and connecting with us. Join us again in a month on Sunday, 27th May. Good night.